Hey guys, my husband and I came across this video from 1999 that he and some colleagues made about the 1948 flood. It has tons of really cool old footage, some amazing interviews, and I think considering everything that's happening in our beautiful Fraser Valley right now, it's a really neat time to share it and to have a look and see that we're not the first people, and unfortunately we probably won't be the last people to be in this situation. I'm currently lucky to be in Greendale on dry land and so thankful for that right now. So I hope everybody else out there is doing okay, and us coming together as a community just is the most amazing thing. So check out this video, it's pretty neat.
In the late spring of 1948, melting snow in the mountains of British Columbia created excessive water runoff. The Fraser River rose steadily and threatened the communities who lived along its course. Though others felt the wrath of the swollen Fraser River, none felt its power of destruction more than the communities of the Fraser Valley.
You can pick up a phone in 2 minutes and tell you how much water's at Prince George or coming in on the North or South Thompson or this type of thing. In those days, there was no accurate recordings except maybe some old guy lived up in the hills and says, God, the snow's deep.
The engineer came out and met us on the river bank at Ridgedale, about 2 miles from here. And he told us we didn't have a thing to worry about. Well, we weren't inclined to agree with him.
We worried about that because we saw Dad was worried. But as a 10-year-old kid, I didn't really realize how serious this could be.
Just about all of our, 95% of the effort on the dike here had been spent up at the Ridgedale area, which the river comes in and makes a little bit of a bend, and so the river really pounds in on that area. That's where we have been spending all of our time.
We were filling sandbags before the dike broke at the naval station. And one of our neighbors said, a flood is almost as destructive as a fire. Well, maybe more.
We didn't think that we would be affected, but we did go out one evening in the boat and went down to Kilby's, and we saw the water from the Harrison River breaking over.
Nobody really thought that there would be a flood. There had been a flood in 1894, and nobody had done too much. The dikes were built after that time, and people just left it at that.
When the river started coming up, they started throwing sandbags and stuff across in some of the low-lying areas, but then it got to the point that there was just no point.
It was scary, actually, because Dad had been patrolling the dike together with other farmers in that area. And he always felt safest when he was on the dike, because then he knew what was going on. But we heard about the seepage that was happening, and so water was coming up on the wrong side of the dike, and so we realized that if that water kept going through, that dike would break.
On the 31st of May, the dike broke. We were under from 3 to 10 feet of water on Masquy, and the land where the engineer had been standing was never seen again.
We were just having our breakfast in the morning, and our neighbor boy almost broke through the door. He says, Mr. Lowen, it's time to get out. So we left that breakfast stayed on the table through the flood. We never finished it.
I don't think anybody had done a lot until it happened, and everybody started getting out there. It was a losing battle.
Despite the tireless effort of thousands of volunteers and Army personnel, the might of the river proved to be too great. The waters of the Fraser washed through the villages and towns of the valley, one after another.
By the time we had got our preparation and were ready to go, we'd packed up the car. The water had crept up the backyard of our place and was now starting to go across the road and across St. Olaf Street. So when we left, we were actually going through a little bit of water. Not very deep, but it was coming.
We had to take our cattle away from our yard, chase them to Clayburn, to higher ground, so that in case the flood came, they would not be underwater. Didn't hire a truck to do it, chased them along the road.
Saving grace, I think, was the people in the district, the younger people. We just got back from a war, so we were Chilliwack, a lot of young people. There was an army base. Even then, we didn't think we would need that. But it was a shock when it came.
I remember that we packed the valuables on top of a table in the dining room. Stuff like my dad's violin, some of the more valuable things. But we didn't take a whole lot with us because we were kind of hoping nothing would happen. And we didn't think that the water would come that high.
Well, they declared a state of emergency, and then they evacuated most of the women and children, but a lot of people had cattle and some of their children that went with them, and a lot of people on high ground, they just stayed with their families. So I would say that you probably evacuated probably more than 50% of the women and children.
I think Agassiz took a terrible pounding. They were in bad shape.
Well, basically there were no dikes in Agassiz in 1948. A few of the low spots, the farmers and people had filled them in so that the normal high waters or anything above normal was more or less contained. But there was no dikes to really deal with anything like that.
We had confidence in the people that were appointed on the flood board, being Darcy Baldwin, a colonel just out of the Army, and so on. So that's how I got involved in the flood. He said to me, you were in the Navy. I said, that's right. He says, he'll make you an admiral. Good. So they went to Cultus Lake and got a bunch of these clinker-built old wooden boats with motors in them. And we got people to run them. And we cruised around doing things like that.
Actually, Chilliwack, probably if it hadn't been for people like McGrath and who had a garage in Rosedale and those farmers that were around there who could see what was happening, who'd probably been around in the '94 flood, they probably would have been underwater in Chilliwack.
District had a bunch of trucks. People had trucks. They volunteered the trucks. Eventually, I guess they got paid for gas. I don't really know, but they had them full of rocks and gravel, and they were hauling them up and down dikes, and people were filling up sandbags, and it was just a total community effort. Total.
Well, a great number of my neighbors went to the Abbotsford airport then, and they were billeted there, and their cattle herds were there.
A lot of people went out to the airport, and of course the airport became the common ground for cattle. You know, the thing is, there was a lot of cattle that was moved to other farms in the highland area, but there were a lot of cattle that were moved to the airport. So you can imagine the massive milking operation that took place at the airport twice a day.
Oh, lots of kids. There were slides there. Loved that. The fun part was eating in a cafeteria. I'd never eaten in a restaurant before, and so now we had the luxury of eating like the rich people. And then we'd have to go out and pick berries all day. That was the fun of it.
I think it was, once the initial shock was over, I think everything was just more or less to carry on for what you had to do and to look after yourselves.
The water was there, and People had moved out of their houses. By this time, they worried the berry crops were gone. People had their cows up on Ryder Lake, on Promontory, over in Agassiz, Kent District. They had them up on the Cemetery Mountain. The Navy had landing barges all up and down the river, were picking up the milk cans.
On the radio, of course, the dairies in Vancouver are telling the farmers to ship their milk. So very faithfully, he'd bring the milk down and went into a milk truck there, which was taken down to the Roche, and then a barge that was manned by Navy personnel would take this milk and into Vancouver. Well, as I say, it was a barge that was very slow moving. The weather was very hot, so we did this, and by the end of the month, we got our check, 25 cents a can, sour. And I remember saying, I'll bet they made a lot of good cottage cheese out of it.
Dermodys were some people we knew real well, and they had a store up there. And the water just ran in one door and out the other. There was maybe 8 or 10 inches, but they sold, they just moved the groceries higher up, and they just carried on. It was pretty much a carry-on process, really.
After the water had come in and settled, and we had about, around 8 feet of water in the village, then there was time to start to try to recover some of the furnishings and household things, belongings that were in these homes.
It took 2 of us, my brother and I, with all we could do, to drag a wet mattress out of the house. You don't know how heavy a wet mattress is.
Well, this one raft, we were trying to get it on, and of course you had to keep it balanced. Well, they brought an iron mangle on, which weighed probably about 150 pounds, and it tilted the raft, and everything went overboard. Well, everybody looked at me, and since I was the youngest, they felt that I was the one that was going to have to dive down and tie a rope to the heavier things so that they could pull them up. And they were standing up on the roof with ropes, and I would dive down into this mucky, dirty water. And I guess that was, when you're 18, you probably don't know any better, and it was an adventure.
And we went in these boats to get the cattle in, and there was a Jersey bull, and it was pretty mean. And we had 2 boats and a rope on each one, and every time the bull would come across to a high part of land, he would get pretty upset with the world, and then we'd pull him down in the deep water. And when we got him to where they were going to load him on a truck, Carl Campbell, I think his name was, had a trucking company. He hauled cattle, and he said he could handle this bull, and we said, well, good for you. And away we went, and the bull ran up in the truck, knocked half the truck down. And
Navy took us by boat to the place, to our farm, so we could look around and try to get a few things out of the water. The water came in the house to the windowsills, and in the barn it touched the ceiling over there.
I was concerned. My wife and I had bought a new house, and we hadn't moved in, and the people were plastering the house, had just finished, and the fellow that sold us the house said, well, I'm sorry, you can't move into the house because the plasterers can't get back to Mission. They're going to live in the house till the water goes down.
An old guy just lived just out in the edge of town. He had a cow, and so he evacuated, but he left his cow and he built a platform. So I guess everybody that went by there with a boat went in, and the cow probably got milk more than any cow. Probably got milk 8 or 10 times a day.
Jack Barber, he was a dentist, and he came with the idea that he would get a fishing pole and a hook. Then he could catch the chickens. They were all in the chicken barns, were all sitting up on roosts and so on. So he was catching these chickens and doing a wonderful job, stuffing them in a gunny sack. When the boat he was in, when it got back to where the edge of the water and took the chickens out, they'd all smothered. So he kind of got told that he better stick to dentistry and stay out of the poultry business.
One person drowned, a Ridgedale farmer, wading back to see what his home was like.
One of our neighbors, Mr. Isaac and his wife, they were, it was their 19th wedding day, and they wanted to go out and see what their house looked like. And they came to the naval station, and the naval station had a walk which they had used during the war to, to patrol the place. But this particular little bridge over a creek, it was attached to the one side, and they walked on it and didn't realize it was floating at the other end. They both stepped over, but this man, he saw he couldn't make it. He had hip boots, and they were filling with water, so he did everything he could to push his wife up, and she got out of the water, and she lived, but he drowned. Actually, one casualty that shouldn't have happened.
For weeks, the floodwaters stagnated in the valley. As dikes were repaired and the river began to drop, the water slowly receded, revealing the true extent of the flood's damage. The flood had taken little pity.
Probably the first part of July, the water started to go down. Then we could see the bad parts of a flood. The smell, the stench, the mosquitoes.
Oh, the cleanup was awful. The floors, the linoleum, there was a film of soil and other stuff in there. To clean that was quite a job.
Well, it was filthy, there wasn't really so very much silt, just a thin layer on everything.
Our home, because we were on a little higher elevation, certainly you might say the bad effects were to the floor, and we had about 12 to 15 inches of water on our first floor. So the floor had to be completely replaced.
One lady I know, she said she hated the house when she went back in. They rebuilt it, but she said that smell was there. There was a smell, a musty, dirty smell, because there was mud. Cleaning out the houses was a heartbreaker for most women, and I do know that.
It's kind of exciting to think that all this was covered with water, and you come back and start over. But then the Red Cross helped us. They replaced all of our furniture and things like that, so we felt kind of fortunate about that.
We got aid, $4 million some odd dollars. Today, if it happened, it would be $400 million or more.
The government, I think, with a guilty conscience, were very generous. and people all across Canada, and I think the United States as well, were very generous, and we did receive an awful lot of aid. Yeah, we will not see that much aid again, I'm sure.
All of the agencies, the Red Cross, the Salvation Army, the both provincial and federal governments, they all gave great assistance.
When they started to rebuild the houses, issuing vouchers, the Soldier Settlement Board at the time and the assessors went around to the various houses, and they would say, okay, he needs so many sheets of gyprock or so much linoleum or whatever. And then we'd fill our requisitions out and deliver the stuff to the home. And
the Red Cross, the government, the aid and the assistance that came in, I would say that there were more people that came out ahead after the flood than what they had previously, because there were new tables and chairs that came into them, and some people were not living very well, but afterwards they had some much better furnishings, you might say.
Well, by now, we had heard lots of stories. We knew people that were getting saved. They'd lost a Chesterfield suite, and we knew they didn't have a Chesterfield suite.
With support from neighbors and community involvement, most of the valley's residents had rebuilt or repaired damage from the flood by late autumn.
And one thing that was noticeable when there's a disaster like that, people are more friendly. Yeah, they help one another far better than they do ordinarily. Yeah.
Neighbors helped out one another. That was a big thing. When something like a flood or something comes, people get together and they help each other.
When we're living life pretty easy, then where there's a lot of time for complaints and beefing, but at that particular time, there was a lot of time for working together.
People pretty well pull and work together because there's no monetary benefit, so you might as well help each other out. So consequently, I think emergencies, I don't say they're good, but I think to some extent they're good for people.
I think when it comes to nature, you don't know what's going to happen. You can do everything possible. You can build the biggest dikes and the biggest dams and do all this, and if some particular circumstance takes place, it's all gone.
Well, if Mother Nature wants to win, she will. I don't care what kind of preparation that you make. You could make dikes the best in the world, and Mother Nature could bring those down in a matter of hours.
It was an experience I don't think any of us would want to do twice. It's like fighting in a war. Once is all you'd want of that, and a flood, that's all I would want of that.
You don't want to, you would rather not have it happen a second time in your life.
$16,000 Valley residents were evacuated. 3,800 were young children. Every able-bodied man over 14 years old had to report to work or be fined. Thousand acres in Greendale flooded in under 24 hours. Some areas were 34 feet deep. Over 3,000 Army, Navy, and Air Force personnel, 1,200 trucks, 7,500 Red Cross volunteers. More than 30,000 volunteers labored on the dikes. Nearly 200 miles of dike had to be reconstructed. High mark, 24.71 feet, the highest recorded since 1894. Unofficial figures place the total cost of repairing flood damage, rebuilding dikes, and the fighting of the rising river at $13 million. Loss of crops, furniture, and personal belongings were not included in this total.